समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
This episode of Cut the Clutter has been set up by Lieutenant General Rahul Singh, one of the 3 deputy chiefs of Army staff. Indian Army has 3 deputy chiefs. Who they are and what they do by way of each one's work division or responsibilities, that Snehesh Alex Philip, who will just join me in a few minutes, he will explain to us. However, Lieutenant General Rahul Singh said while speaking at a FICCI event, he made several interesting points. That 7.5 minute clip is with you. I'm sharing that with you in the description. It's also available on our website already and has had a lot of viewing. Now, I know the headline point that he's made is that the Chinese were closely involved and Chinese were helping Pakistan very closely, and the Chinese used the method, and that's one of the 36 stratagems of Chinese tradition, Chinese military tradition, which is, in fact, it's the second of the 36, that is killing with a borrowed knife, which means using somebody else to do your dirty job. I will come to the 36 stratagems in a couple of minutes as we go along, because this has become the headline point or the most highlighted point. However, I will also list for you some other important and interesting things that the Deputy Chief said, that Lieutenant General Rahul Singh said. So first, he said, and again, candor. What I have liked this time from our armed forces communication, which is much better, which has been much better, enormously better than our political communication or non-communication. Armed forces have been very candid. In parts, as in when they speak, they are candid. And you can see that professionalism actually speaking out. So he said, we looked at our indigenous air defense systems. Many of them work very well, some not so well. So the very fact that he says that some did not work so well, that is not something to feel rotten about. That is something to feel good about, that you have people at that level of leadership in your armed forces also looking within to see what needs to be corrected or what needs to be improved. So that is one highlight for me. Then he says that, look, this air defense business, that somebody attacks you with multiple instruments, with drones, with long-range artillery, with rocket artillery, with missiles of various kinds, with aircraft, to carry out air defense against them, to prevent any of these attacks from being effective. It's a cat and mouse game. You do something, they do something. They do something, you do something. Or what we will call in Hindi, जिसको हम हिंदी में बोलेंगे, तो डाल डाल मैं पात, right? So you keep chasing each other. In that process, he said, this time one matter of relief was that our population centers were not under attack. That's also an acknowledgement that both countries, both armed forces targeted each other's military targets. But he said, who knows tomorrow? He implied, he didn't say it, he implied, who knows tomorrow? So we have to keep that in mind, which means we have to find much better air defenses, much more widespread air defenses, and also counters to various methods of attack from a distance, including rocket artillery. That was an important point. Then he says that this was a fight not just on one front. Initially he says maybe on 2 fronts, but then he says no. The fight was on one front, but one front against 3 enemies. So who are the 3 enemies? Pakistan was enemy who was actually fighting. Then China, that was helping the Pakistanis. He makes a point that is well known, that over the past several years now, in fact, I would say for more than a decade now, decade and a half now, 81% of all of Pakistan's defense acquisitions have been from China. That's a reality. However, we have to remember that Chinese don't give anybody anything for free. Chinese ask you for money. Chinese are not as expensive as Western equipment, and increasingly we can see that Chinese technology is now reaching the same levels as that of Western equipment. And that is the reason the Chinese are now standing up in a way that they are beginning to look like a threat, a near peer to America, particularly to an engagement that takes place closer to China's shores. Anything that takes place will be far away from America's shores. However, the gap between the Chinese capability and America's, even on many individual systems, has now been narrowing. The Chinese are willing to sell some of that, most of it to Pakistan. Pakistan is the biggest buyer of Chinese military hardware, and Pakistan pays for it. It's cheaper than buying from America, France, Brazil, any of the others. That's true, but the Chinese sell it. That 81% hardware, however, is not the issue, or not so much of an issue. Yes, it's an issue, but not so much of an issue. The issue is the software side of it, and software side of it is where live information comes in while a warlike situation or a short war is going on, because Chinese then have the space filled with their satellites. In fact, from what I've read in international military media, during this 3-day conflict, in that period, in the states of India which were seeing this conflict, that is Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat, those are the border states across which this conflict was taking place. There were 7 Chinese military satellites present there, obviously orbiting. And so the Chinese were picking up a lot of information right down to the tactical level and immediately passing it on to the Pakistanis. That I'm not saying, that's what General Rahul Singh is saying. He says that is where the Chinese used one of their 36 stratagems, and that stratagem is killing by a borrowed knife. So Pakistan is your proxy. Use it as your knife. It's a borrowed knife. I would say it's a proxy to whom you have gifted a knife, or gifted a knife at a very affordable price. Then General Singh goes on to say that for the Chinese it's also useful because this is an opportunity for them to check out their new weapon systems in a warlike scenario, or in a war, albeit a short one, where it will come up against rival systems from elsewhere. These could be French systems, American systems, Russian systems, or these could be India's indigenous systems. This became a kind of a live lab for testing Chinese weapons. Then he says the Turkish also came in. We know about Bayraktar drones, but this time they brought in many other drones, and many of these drones arrived in Pakistan while this fighting was going on. We know that the Turkish naval ship came in. Apparently, it was carrying a supply of drones. Some more Turkish cargo aircraft also landed in Pakistan just as this thing was picking up. So those are supposed to have built more drones into Pakistan. He also said the Turks had their trained personnel in Pakistan as well. So Turkey therefore makes the third of these 3 enemies across one frontier. Then he says that when DGMO level talks were on, the Pakistani DGMO was telling ours that, look, we know that such and such Indian vector, such and such vector is being primed and is ready for launch against us. We request you, I'm quoting General Singh, we request you to stop it, to pull it back. Which means they had real-time intelligence and information surveillance on whatever we were doing. And that's why I said we have to now, in the next round, whatever that happens, I'm adding that, he didn't say the next round. He says now we have to look at our C4 ISR situation. Now what is C4 ISR situation? That is something you will find military people using very often. That is command, control, communication and computers. That's the 4 C's. So once again, command, control, communications and computers, that's the 4 C's or C4. Then intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. That ISR. So C4 ISR. And he says that we have to strengthen our C4 ISR. Then he says that, look, we'll have to worry about populated areas going ahead. At the same time, we can't be like Israel and its Iron Dome system because we are a much bigger country. Israel is a much smaller country. Also, those systems are very expensive. So our systems have to be improved, particularly C4 ISR has to be improved, which means I'm interpreting now that India should also be able to assess and anticipate threats or vectors on the Pakistani side as those are being primed for a launch on Indian targets. You can then also use intelligence, telemetry, computers to also figure out where these are headed. So those are the areas of priorities. And then he gives some details and some explanation for what India did. He said initially 21 targets were identified. These are terror pads and terror bases. Finally, it was reduced to 9. And this list also was dynamic. This list was not static. This was changing in terms of how the realities were changing on the ground, maybe how the personnel were moving, or terrorists were moving, or their leaders were moving, or the feasibility of attacks. Finally, these 9 were attacked. And then he says India set up an escalatory ladder. That's an interesting point. He says, first we attacked only terrorist pads, did not attack the Pakistani military, and used information warfare to convey this clearly. But the Pakistanis decided that they had to attack our military assets, which they did. I presume that references to Pakistan Air Force firing at IAF aircraft inside Indian airspace, deep inside Indian airspace, using beyond visual range weapons. When the Pakistanis did that, so Pakistanis took it to this level of escalation, then India took it further to the next escalation level by leveling so many of Pakistani air bases the next day. That is the night of 9th and 10th, and then through the day until late afternoon on the 10th. And those are the pictures that we've seen all this while. Those pictures will also be running on your screen. These are the most wanted Pakistani air bases, the most distant of them, by the way. Most of these air bases that IAF attacked, or that Indian forces attacked, and Pakistanis also acknowledged that all the weapons launched from the Indian side were air to surface. They are not surface to surface. They were launched air to surface, which means Indian aircraft had gone up. They must have gone to some altitude and fired these weapons from there. And these were BrahMos missiles, which only Sukhoi 30s can fire. There were Scalp that Rafale fires. There was Hammer that both Rafale and Mirages can fire. Also Hammer, Jaguars can fire. Jaguars were also used. And when all this was happening, please take note of the fact, I'm adding that, the general didn't speak about this, that PAF on the 10th did not rise, even in daylight, did not rise to defend their air bases or to attack or to counter these Indian aircraft who were firing these standoff weapons at them. And he says then another level of escalation was established, and then the Pakistanis sued for peace. They called in the afternoon asking for a ceasefire, and I will repeat his action. He said there was a punch ready like this. There was a strong punch ready, and Pakistanis knew what this punch was, and that's why they sought ceasefire. Now, I presume they also knew what punch was ready because the Chinese system, the satellites and the C4 ISR system was telling the Pakistanis, at least telling the Pakistanis exactly what was being primed. Now, having said that, let me come back to the 36 stratagems business, because that's interesting, because General Singh talked about this. It also made me read up on this. So I read up on this on the familiar sources, but I also read up on this in some Chinese publications. It took me some time on a Friday when I also have to write my column, and very interesting cricket is also going on. But also in an article in Forbes magazine, and that Forbes magazine article, of which I will share a link with you, that also tells you how these ideas can be used in the corporate world as well, because these are about strategy. These are 36 ideas, and these do not come from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu was much older. This comes from China's medieval history, from a bunch of texts called Book of Qi, as in QI, Book of Qi, 7th volume. These are 36 stratagems. I obviously will not list 36 stratagems for you. That is about 1.5 full episode of Cut the Clutter. I will share all 36 with you. I'll share a link, and I'm also sharing this Forbes article, which gives you a more modern corporate interpretation of this. Also uses corporate and sometimes even basketball examples there to make it simpler for American audiences, but see the important ones that matter to us. So number one of these 36 stratagems is look west and attack east, which means collect your forces as if you're going to attack in one direction. Today that will also mean creating so much more electronic noise to make it sound like that's where you're going, but go in the opposite direction. So the Forbes article in fact tells you in basketball terms that is pretending to move left but actually going right. That's a game that is played in hockey, football all the time. That's called a feint. So the first is a simple one. Second, besiege Wei to rescue Zhao. Now Wei and Zhao were actually two monarchs of that era. What this means is that if you want to rescue your friend, then you go and besiege somebody else in whose help then whoever is threatening your friend will then have to thin out and go to rescue the other guy. So to rescue Zhao, who's your friend, which in this case is Pakistan, you besiege Wei, and that is what is being done right now. Third, he says, and that's the key one. जब मैंने शुरू में second बोला था ना, ये third है. This is the third of the 36 stratagems. So the key stratagem is kill with a borrowed knife. And that we explained to you, which is have someone else do the dirty job for you. And next one, number 4 is also important. Wait at leisure while the enemy labors, which means tire the enemy out. That is something the Chinese may be trying to do, say, in eastern Ladakh, because they are much closer to their populated centers, and because they are on the plateau side, their communication, their transport is also, it is tough, but much easier, much less tough than on the Indian side. Indian side has to deal with much tougher elements, so tire out the other side and choose your time, lie in wait and choose your time for when you want to attack or move in. Fifth, loot a burning house. That means when another adversary is in trouble, then you infiltrate and take what you can. This is very relevant for India. And it also says the stratagem also make sure that you don't get trapped in a burning house. Now, this is very relevant when we look at so much internal subversion that goes on in India. And that also reminds us that India has to be very, very, very careful about this internal subversion. We leave out the next 3, come to 9, which says observe the fire from the opposite shore or sit on the mountain and watch tigers fight. And when the tigers get exhausted, then you move in to take advantage. That is precisely how they'll be looking at the India-Pakistan situation right now. Then point 11, I'm again jumping a point, borrow a corpse to resurrect the soul. What does it mean? It means discover either some old technology or old methodology or idea or ideology which may not be relevant to you, but which can create something that helps you in your larger pursuit. Think of Maoism, think of armed Maoism, say in India. That works fully to China's benefit. Think also of the insurgencies that the Chinese backed in the Northeast in the past. A lot of that was done in the name of Maoism, right? Even NSCN initially was a Maoist communist group. That's why National Socialist Council of Nagaland. That's how socialists came in. In East Central India, in the mineral-rich East Central India, the same Maoism had been brought in Nepal as well. So this is a case because Maoism itself, classical Maoism, is dead in China. That is a corpse. So borrow a corpse to resurrect the soul. In this case, you don't just borrow a corpse, you lend a corpse to resurrect the soul. And then the next one I jump to is 19, again very relevant to India, steal the firewood from under the pot, which means take away the adversaries' resources and assets. See for how long India has not been able to mine any of the rare mineral deposits, rare earth deposits that India has. India has had an Indian Rare Earth Corporation forever, but how little does it produce? Because India has no access to its own rare earths where they exist. Point 23, befriend distant states while attacking a neighbor, right? That's a little bit like keeping the Russians on your side in your camp while you are watching India attacked with a borrowed knife, right? That's what completes this triangle. And then I come to the last point, 36. If all fails, retreat, right? It says that if all fails and you're losing, there are three options: surrender, compromise, or escape. And the best option then is to escape. I've given you just 7 or 8 of these 36 stratagems from the seventh volume of the Book of Chi from medieval Chinese history, which is the point that we have Snehesh Alex Philip join us. Snehesh, Deputy Chief has spoken. Tell us about this Deputy Chief and what is the structure in Indian Army of Deputy Chiefs and what they do.
Lieutenant General Rahul Singh comes from the Corps of Artillery. And before he took over as the Deputy Chief, he was in charge. He was commanding the Ambala-based 2 Strike Corps, which is one of the 4 strike corps that are there. And when I say 4, I'm including the Mountain Strike Corps too. So this is Pakistan-based Strike Corps.
Pakistan directed
Pakistan focused, Pakistan directed strike
corps. And
corps.
It's one of the oldest strike corps.
It is one of the oldest
strike corps. In fact, it's a strike corps that operated in 1965 and 1971
also
in the Sialkot sector.
Exactly. And then so he's in charge of capability development and knowledge, anything which means that he will look at all the modernization efforts, the capital procurements, what needs to be procured, what the commands would need, different regiments in the Indian Army would need. So he's the man in charge of that. Along with that, you also have 2 other deputy chiefs. One is, of course, the deputy chief strategy, and Lieutenant General Ghai, who's also the DGMO, is also the deputy chief. So he's handling both the
Rajiv Ghai.
Yeah, Rajiv Ghai. Lieutenant General Rajiv Ghai is handling both the portfolios.
And we've seen a lot of him because he was speaking on behalf of the armed forces. He was representing the army. There was Army, Navy, and Air Force. So he was representing the army and built a fan club of his own.
Yes, and he's an infantry officer, so he's from the Kumaon regiment. And then you have one more deputy chief. He's in charge of information systems and coordination. That's Lieutenant General Rakesh Kapoor. He's an armored corps officer, so he's looking after the digital aspect of it. He's looking at the tech intelligence aspect of it. So he's involved in that. So the 3 deputy chiefs have been given specific tasks.
Yeah, and it's interesting that each one is from a different arm.
Each one is from a different
infantry, artillery, and armor.
Yeah, it is. In a sense, it's not as if
it's not a rule.
It's not a rule. They could have been from the infantry or from the armored. But yes, at this particular point of time, you have 3 from different arm of the Indian Army.
So what's in the heart of the general when he's speaking this, and why is the government putting out this message? Because these things are not said until they've been discussed and decided upon.
See, I don't know what is in the heart of the general. Wish I had known, but I think
no, I don't mean personally. What I mean is, what is it that the army or that the armed forces or government of India through the armed forces is trying to convey? What is the deeper motivation in doing this?
I think the deeper, he was speaking at a FICCI event. And so this is not him formally speaking on behalf of the Indian Army. So, but, of course, it's part of a written statement. A speech is prepared and he's speaking from the points that he has already made up in his notes or in his mind. But the fact is that I think during Operation Sindoor, I think some of the briefings that were undertaken by the DGMO and his counterparts, that is in the Air Force, when Bharti sir, as well as the naval
That is Air Marshal
DG of
A.K.
operations,
Bharti.
yeah, and Air Marshal.
Mahesh takes his hierarchy very seriously.
And so I think all the three of them were very precise in their communications. They were, for example, I still remember when Air Marshal A.K. Bharti sir was asked whether there have been any losses. He said ki, losses are part of combat, and he did not try to sidestep it. Well, of course, you could say that he didn't really answer in as many words in detail, but he was someone who accepted it. But he said you should focus on the larger objective.
In fact, he showed a certain nonchalance that you should look at the larger objective. When you go out in combat, there will be losses.
Yeah, and he said, did we achieve those military objectives? Yes. And he said the overwhelmingly yes. I think the same goes for the DGMO. Lieutenant General Guy sir, he has also, whenever he's spoken with a very clear mind. I think when Lieutenant General Rahul Singh spoke, I think it was one of the most candid assessment of Operation Sindoor. I love the fact that many of the retired people, many people in the media fraternity and those involved in defense, we keep talking about the fact that you've written an article. I think this was on the 7th of June, National Interest, in which you mentioned that this is the Operation Sindoor was the first battle of the two-front war. I think Lieutenant Rahul Singh is carrying forward what you've written, and he's saying that this was one border with three adversaries. So I think this was a very frank assessment coming in from a serving officer, which is very rare. I'll take you back to, and he said that when the DGMOs were speaking to each other, the Pakistanis knew exactly where our vectors were. So vectors is a military term that they use.
Vector is what essentially what moves.
Yeah, what moves. So whichever, for example, let's say BrahMos or any other missile that is being used to fire.
An aircraft. BrahMos
exactly
strapped on it.
So they knew exactly where. So they were like, we know where it is deployed. It would be good if you could push it back. So which means that he said that China was actively giving live inputs to Pakistan. So I'll take you back to what the serious General Anil Chauhan had said at the Shangri-La dialogue, and he was asked this question, whether there was any Chinese, did you see any active Chinese involvement? At that time, surprisingly, even though multiple people in the fraternity, and even we've had this discussion where you've told me, and we've had this discussion, that there was active involvement of China, especially when it came to locations and giving strategic inputs to the Pakistani military.
And tactical inputs.
Tactical and strategic inputs to the Pakistani military. So, but the CDS had said that there was no proof of any direct involvement of China. But here you have, Lieutenant General Rahul Singh really putting it out, saying the big lessons that is learned. And this is something that I think the armed forces will take into mind in the future ahead. The fact that you're not fighting just Pakistan, and you're not fighting a Pakistan that has been supplied that is using Chinese equipment, but you're going to be fighting with Pakistan that will be given intelligence inputs on a real-time basis
and
information by China, and information would be where a fighter is located, at what time a fighter would have taken off, what kind of military movement is happening on the Indian side. So everything is tracked through satellite. That is why.
And satellites are also through eavesdropping on your electronic communication wherever possible.
Yeah, wherever.
Or breaking the encryption wherever possible.
Absolutely. And the Chinese capability, I don't want to get into what it will be. I'll go into the realm of speculation. But we all know what the Chinese are capable of. I think the Indian Army is also quite aware of it. But I think this operation has revealed how China and Pakistan can collude with each other. So as he mentioned, and which you explained further, The fact is that for China, Pakistan continues to be a borrowed knife. And he also said that Chinese would prefer this rather than the mudslinging match in Eastern Ladakh, where you actually will have to get your hands dirty. Chinese don't want to do that.
So Snehesh, now that I have with you, we also had headlines today that Defense Acquisition Committee, DAC,
Defense
that
Acquisition
has
Council.
cleared about 1.05 trillion rupees worth of purchases. So what are some highlights from this? What gaps is India trying to fill? And then what will happen now? Because I believe the procedure is still long. It's not as if you can now go with a shopping list and a checkbook.
Well, I always say that, what the MOD has given is AON, which is acceptance of necessity. So what acceptance of necessity means is, for example, how does a procurement really functions? So somebody at the force headquarters will sit down. They will have their internal committees and all. They'll sit down. They will identify what we are lacking. So they will identify what we really want. And then a file is moved. So in the current system, the file first goes to a committee under the IDS, which is an integrated thing. And it undergoes a lot of deliberations, tweaks, changes, whatever questions are raised, and things like that. And then from the IDS, it
What does
goes,
IDS stand for?
Integrated Defense Staff.
Integrated Defense Staff.
Yeah, the IDS. Yeah.
So you have officers from Army, Navy, Air Force.
Yeah, you have officers from the Army, Navy, Air Force, which is now handled, which comes under the CDS, right?
Department of Military Affairs.
Yeah, Department of Military Affairs. And from there, the file is eventually moved. It goes through processes. It eventually moved to what is known as the DPB, which is the Defense Procurement Board. This is headed by the Defense Secretary. So there are multiple agenda points that are looked at, that are discussed at the DPB level, and it is only once the issues are thrashed is when it is then goes further to the DAC. Now, what happens after the DAC? Now, the DAC gives acceptance of necessity, which means that the government of India, the Defense Ministry, is in agreement with the service that yes, you need this, right? So while we are sitting here and talking, remember that the MRFA contract, the one for 114, has not undergone any of these processes. So the MRFA contract papers or the file to move,
or MMRCA.
MMRCA, which is the earlier one, now it is known as the MRFA. It is still at the Air Force headquarters level itself. It has not moved further, right? Because they're waiting clearance from the government. So once this AON is given is when the force will come out with a request for information. RFI is issued. Now, RFI is where you put out your demand in normal circumstances, and the companies will, and saying that this is what we need, tell us what do you have. Then the companies will respond.
For each, there will be some time provided.
Of course, there is time provided there. That is there. And then once the RFI responses are received, the services headquarters will go through all these responses, and then they will issue an RFP, which is request for proposal.
So out of a further short list of these RFIs, in terms of whatever is most suitable, they will say request for proposals, RFP.
Yeah, RFP. So that is the RFP again. So RFP is issued, then the tendering process starts. They send in the responses. Before RFP is issued, you have this pre-bid negotiations, clarifications, lot of letters, words are exchanged. And then the companies would send in the proposal, right? When the companies would send in the proposal is when the further trials and all will take place. So you will have you'll have summer trials, which happens in the desert. Then you have winter trials, which happens only during winter. So this 1 year, summer and winter itself is 1 year. Winter trials is usually high altitude trials. Then, for example, if there is some lacunae found, let's say if none of the companies are able to deliver to the thing, the companies would be given a feedback. Then they are given a chance to redo the trials. But then the winter trials cannot happen at the same time because the companies have to come back with solutions.
By that time, the weapon system may be obsolete.
By that time, the weapon system is already nearing its obsolescence stage, right? And then is when this whole thing comes up, and then you select the best one. So, for example, let's say you have qualified. Let's say 2 people get qualified. Then you open the tender documents, the cost. Then you look at the L1, right? And then the cost negotiations happen because the L1 tendering, the cost was given at a was given earlier by the time the trials and all have finished. So you have a cost negotiation. There would be some kind of an, there's a mathematical term that you use for higher rate than what was quoted earlier. So the negotiation starts. Once that negotiation is done, it's completed. Then based on the value of the order, I think it's about 500 crores or 1,000 crores, it goes to the DSC for clearance. The DSC clears it. If it's a value of 3,000 crores, then it goes to the Cabinet Committee of Security, which is headed by the Prime Minister of the country. So it's a long drawn process.
Yeah.
Ideally, the procurement is supposed to be completed about 2 years, ideally, 2 years. But this whole process itself would take about 6-7 years. For example, let's say if you talk about the P75 India project, right? I think I started reading about P75
That's the
India.
submarines.
The submarines, I started reading about P75 India when I was in journalism school. And I still report on P75
That was
India.
just 2 years back.
And I still report on P75 India. Next week, I'm actually doing a couple of stories on submarines. So that would be
It's
out.
very interesting because if you look at our mid-air refuelers, this was that Indian Air Force and Navy need these
Yeah.
6 refuelers was cleared in 2007.
Yeah.
And we keep on clearing it every few years. And the
Exactly.
process starts again.
Yeah.
And now once again, this has been cleared. Once again, process will start, and God knows when this will happen. By which time, I suspect Elon Musk will have gas stations floating in the air, so you could plug and play there. That is how long our process takes. So
The technology, for example, let's say if you talk about, many people would probably hate me for saying this, but for example, let's say if you look at, the Air Force Chief mentioned, when he was asked about AMCA, he said, I don't want to say what generation it's going to be, but whenever it is going to be out, it should not be outdated. Now we have an Astra missile, indigenous Astra missile, brilliant missile, which has been integrated with the aircraft, has a particular range. Now they're going in for the Astra Mark II. The day the Astra Mark II is launched, is officially out, it will already be outdated because Astra Mark II has a range of about 120 kilometers. Pakistanis are already using the PL-15,
which is
an export
250.
version, and which is the export version. An export version is always the
Scaled down version.
Scaled down version of what the Chinese have. So what the Chinese have is a different PL-15. What the Pakistanis have is a minimum 150 kilometers range air-to-air missile, whereas the Astra Mark II would be only 120. So instead of Astra Mark II, what we should actually be focusing is on Astra Mark III and Astra Mark IV. So that's so this whole procurement process.
Because in today's warfare, to be second best is no great relief.
Absolutely.
Because you can say you have more numbers, but that means you are just taking losses for granted.
And plus numbers, in terms of humans, if you're saying yes, but in terms of for example, when you speak to the Americans, they will also admit to the fact that China has the advantage of numbers. In the sense, when I say advantage of numbers, the ability to produce in large numbers.
Yes.
Even if, let's say, the missile is not as per what Chinese claims, but the fact is that they can overwhelm any defensive system of the US with the sheer play of numbers.
So this is very interesting, Snehesh. Actually, to tell you the truth, Defense Secretary Rajesh Kumar Singh,
Yeah.
I have heard him speak in a few places. I think this was on Smita Prakash's podcast and also TV Network 18 group
The CNBC thing,
conference, CNBC. And I found him fairly clear-headed. I found a fair bit of clarity from him. And in terms of the defense secretaries I might have interacted with in the past, and a little bit after I passed from journalism school, but still a long time back from now. So that is Vijay Singh, or before that, N.N. Vora. So I find similar kind of clarity from Rajesh Kumar Singh also.
I think the current defense minister is very clear on where the issues lie. He's very clear and he's taken it upon a mission for himself. And this is what Defense Minister Rajnath Singh has actually given the task to the Defense Secretary to cut down the entire procurement issue, to clear up the mess. So there's a new DPP that is going to come out, 2025, that the defense secretary is already working on.
Yeah. So of the things he said, a few things for me stand out. One he said that budgets is one thing, but our absorptive capacity
Absolutely.
is something else. So in the past, our revised estimates have been less than our budgeted estimates. So the forces have not been able to spend the money allocated to them.
But those are also because of two reasons. One, because the forces can't absorb that much, and then the processes and decision making is so long.
No, absorb means absorptive capacity means to be able to spend and buy.
Yeah, to be able to spend and buy, yeah.
Complete the processes. The second thing that he has said, which is very interesting, he said this is current defense procurement procedures book is very thick and very cumbersome, and there is need to simplify it,
Yeah.
and you will see one in the next few months. I think October.
This year it will
September
be
or
out.
October is
It's around the September, October is
some
what
kind of
we're
a
expecting.
deadline that this should come out. And the third thing that he mentions is that he's already cutting the procurement procedure by 59 weeks. 59 weeks is 14 months, right? 1 year and 2 months. 52 weeks for 1 year,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
7 weeks. 8 weeks is 2 more months. So 14 months, which means if you can cut a procedure by 14 months, you can imagine how long that procedure is. So by the time you start buying a 5th generation aircraft, 6th will be floating in the
Sixth is already floating in the air.
Fifth, yes, and 6th is floating in the air or almost floating in the air with a hostile power.
Exactly.
Right? So this is the essence of the current situation, and this is why this 3-day engagement has been such a wake-up call for the Indian system. Do we agree, Snehesh?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. I think it was as Lieutenant General Rahul Singh said, that it gave an opportunity for the Chinese to test their missiles against Indian and Western systems. At the same time, it also gave us an insight into what the future warfare is going to be. I think this 3-day conflict was significant in terms of that for both India as well as for the other countries involved in this conflict.
Yeah, and while this is happening, remember the stratagem 9 from the list of 36 stratagems that I just talked about. Chinese are doing just that. And what is stratagem 9? Observe the fire from the opposite shore, or sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight and wait till they are exhausted. And in this case, wait till you think your favorite, quote unquote, favorite tiger will be exhausted. And India has to prepare for that situation, because the Chinese have now shown you their hand as well, and their hand is this borrowed knife.